Hello all, this is Jonathan Kirk, instructor for MUS 102, Music Theory 2, and for this week, number 2, on Monday. And this first video is going to discuss the topics that continue from chapter 12, and this includes an understanding of the basic phrase, connecting the dominant and tonic chords through voice leading, really an introductory conversation about cadences, and talk in depth about voice leading guidelines. And a lot of these things will continue throughout the course. So again, we're following along in chapter 12 on page 234, going to the end of chapter 12. So we start this conversation about some really important things just about the theory of what we're doing here. We are really getting into kind of progression theory. That is the idea that we can understand harmony in a variety of ways. And the way that we do that is, besides just learning what chords are, how to spell them, how to analyze them, we also work on composition. That is putting these chords together to make meaningful works. And we start at really the ground level. So a harmonic progression is really the idea that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a goal-directed process. When we hear a harmonic progression, we can hear it going forward, and we know when it's concluded. So chords are pieced together much like words in a sentence. So the order of those words when we speak and when we write is what makes it communicate something specific, something symbolic. And in many ways, harmony does the same thing. But of course, it's not communicating something symbolic. It's communicating something perhaps like on a deeper level. So this is what we call music. So learning to compose smooth harmonic progressions, it really begins with learning how to connect chords. And we just can't take a chord and put it next to one another. Well, we can, there's nothing wrong with that. But in the style that we work on in this class, we work through voice leading. So connecting the 5 to 1 is really at the heart of this process. It's the framework of any progression, and it's always good to start in the most simple way, right? Where you're just taking one chord and connecting it to another. And as we go on, we'll build outward. So we'll make more chords, and we'll learn ways that we can connect them so that they logically fit within a harmonic progression that you would hear in the common practice period. So connecting 5 to 1 in SATB is the most common way that we can practice writing a harmonic progression. It's the most common way that we learn how to compose in this style. And the most active ingredient in dominant triads is, of course, the leading tone. And I bring this up because the leading tone, that term alone, implies that it has a tendency to lead somewhere. And it certainly does have a strong pull upward to the tonic. Now, you've already kind of discussed this in previous classes where the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, you hear it in the scale, is an important guiding principle in how we hear music going forward. So Elizabeth Marvin, who's one of the authors of the text, she uses this term called the basic phrase. It's a really important concept in this book. The basic phrase is really a collection of ideas. She uses it to refer to kind of a basic structure, common harmonic structure of a complete musical idea. Now, we have many terms that we can use to describe a complete musical idea. The most important one is phrase, but phrase alone can be a little bit confusing because it could mean several things about that music. It could refer to the harmony, in this case, that we're discussing here. It could certainly refer to the melody, right, to sing a phrase or to play a phrase on your instrument. It could also refer to a rhythmic idea. But here she uses the basic phrase to refer to this tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic succession. So begin with tonic, you move through something, you reach a dominant, and then you're back at tonic. Think of it as the kind of cyclical or the pull back to home base in a baseball game, right? So even though you've got players at the bases, there's this constant pull of a goal to score a run and go back to home base. So we think of this as harmonic motion. It goes forward and it moves toward a goal. That goal is tonic. Much like when you try to move forward by speaking or writing a sentence, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end, and you finish the sentence with a period. So when that goal is reached, which is a tonic chord in most cases, right? We feel a point of repose or conclusion. We sense it, right? You can sing any tune that you know really, really well, and you can probably hear that. Think of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. If you sing through that, you can certainly hear where certain moments in those tunes where it comes to a conclusion, or at least not a conclusion, a point of repose or rest. So that moment of repose is referred to as a cadence. And this is really important. And this will serve a very important purpose when we're understanding the basic phrase. Here you can see a good example of a harmonic progression. And it's written in 4 voices, SATB. So we can see here bass, tenor, alto, and soprano. Now, as we look at each chord vertically, we can also see that each voice, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, is on its own as well, horizontally. So this is a vertical and horizontal process, and I'll talk about that a little later. We start here, we're in E flat major. We end this phrase in E flat major. This is the goal. And in Bach's chorale here, and chorales are really something that we'll get used to analyzing. They're just wonderful, very short, almost kind of perfect musical compositions to study harmony, voice leading, and the basic phrase. You can see here that as it moves through, all of these chords they have a purpose, moving toward the goal, communicating this musical idea. The melody here in the soprano voice is heard independent of all the others, and probably many would hear that as the most important voice. But these inner voices and the bass voice are just as important. Even though our ear might not be directed toward those voices, they're playing a very important role. And we can hear this when we listen to all of the voices together. What we're going to focus in is really these last 2 chords, the cadence, right? The conclusion. Now, this is just the first 2 phrases from that chorale. If we consider this a phrase and this a phrase, or we could say this is the first phrase of the chorale, right? There's lots of different ways that we could look at this and say what is a phrase. But in order to do that, we really have to understand this idea of the cadence. And the cadence here is a harmonic idea, a 5 to a 1. So we see that the bass voice is moving the most in terms of its jumping and skipping, right? But the melodies don't do a lot of that. There's a lot of stepwise motion, shorter skips. Of course, jumps when you need them, but still it follows the rules of counterpoint that we'll study next term as well. So a cadence, they're more than just a perceptual idea. You should be able to recognize cadences now, even without having done an intensive study of music theory. And we define them harmonically in this course. The musical role of a phrase is defined in part by its type of cadence, right? So different cadences have different names, and they're defined by that harmonic idea, usually identified after you've analyzed the chords with Roman numerals. Cadences might also sound like a slowing down, either rhythmically or harmonically. The chords don't move as fast, for instance. This is akin to a period in a sentence. But for now, let's just look at cadences that only end on the tonic and dominant. There are other types of cadences, but it's really good to understand, I would say, the most common cadences in common practice music. That is, music of the classical period in the Western tradition that was really written from 1600 up into the 20th century, and really is still at the foundation of the popular music that you listen to today. So the three cadences that we'll look at right now, the half cadence, which ends on the 5 chord, with the melody often ending on scale degree 2, this is obviously an inconclusive phrase ending because it doesn't end on the tonic. But we can still call it a cadence because it still has that moment of repose, and we can certainly hear that. It's a half cadence. We call it the half cadence because it's not quite all the way there. It's only half the way finished. We would need the tonic chord to finish that cadence. An imperfect authentic cadence is within a family of 2 cadences called the authentic cadences. We abbreviate it IAC. It ends with a dominant to tonic, 5-1, but the melody ends on a 3 or a 5. Or either a 5 or 1 is weakened by inversion. So it doesn't have the same kind of strong sound as the perfect authentic cadence, which we'll see in a second. It usually is less conclusive of a phrase ending, but it's certainly more conclusive than the half cadence. And finally, the most common cadence of common practice music is the perfect authentic cadence. It ends with a root position, 5-1. You will not see the 5 in any inversion in the perfect authentic cadence. The melody ends 2-1 or 7-1. Now this is important because look, the melody ends on the tonic pitch just like the bass pitch. That's the perfect authentic cadence. And it's the strongest conclusive phrase ending to a harmonic progression. What we want to hear in cadences, and what we probably already notice, is this sense of resolution. So the dominant moving to tonic, the dominant has to resolve to the tonic. We can see the importance of a voice leading in a cadence, mainly because it will sound conclusive if the voices sound like they're coming to a rest as well. Voices, they must move smoothly. So think of the soprano, alto, and tenor and bass line of the Bach chorale that we just heard, right? Even though there's some jumps in the individual voice melodic lines, you can still hear a lot of stepwise motion. And this is very important in certain points of the cadence. So no jumps or skips when you're talking about the leading tone going up to 1. Right? So the stepwise motion of the leading tone to tonic, the 7-1, is probably at the heart of this. Progressions, both in major and minor, they follow similar patterns of the chordal progressions and the voice leading guidelines that we'll practice all throughout this course. Voice leading in SATB style is going to be kind of a step-by-step process. You're building this much like you're building your repertoire for recipes if you're a chef, right? We don't like to call these rules. They're essentially guidelines. Composers didn't follow them like rules. They used these guidelines so that they could get the clearest harmonic structure out of their music. So we refer to this process of voice leading. And voice leading is a process that involves multiple voices coming together to connect chords. So in the SATB style, we think of connecting chords as both vertical and horizontal. That's what I pointed out with the Bach chorale. Right, so a vertical way of looking at a chord is the way that you would analyze a chord just on its own. Look for the root, stack it in thirds, or look at the chord and determine the quality or hearing a chord just on its own. Horizontal has to do with the voices that create that chord. So the sense that we're actually listening to 4 independent melodies all at the same time. So you're both listening to chords and melodies at the same time. They make up this idea of harmony. So it's a 2-part process. So very much I always stress this point that harmony is about melody as well. So in other words, overlaying 4 melodic voices in SATB style is all about creating chords. And this relates to the practice of counterpoint. And counterpoint comes up a lot in this book, which we'll go into depth next term in MUS 201. A couple of other things about SATB voice leading. In order for the four voices of SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, to sound clear and independent from one another, we have to be really careful in how we move them from note to note in relation to the other voices. And when I say we have to be careful, we want them to always sound independent in the way that we would hear a clarity in the harmony. So parallel motion between perfect intervals, and by perfect I mean octaves and fifths, not necessarily fourths, but just perfect octaves and perfect fifths. The parallel motion obscures this independence. It's hard to hear the movement of two voices if they move together. If voices move in opposite directions, it's much easier to hear them independently. If they move together, either in octaves or perfect fifths, it's harder to determine where they are. In the common practice period of Western classical music, composers, mind the typo here, composers wanted to maintain the clarity of individual voices. Now this comes from choral music. So even the idea of maintaining the clarity of the individual voices that you hear in the polyphonic music of the choral tradition of the 1600s, 1700s, they wanted to preserve that even in instrumental music, orchestral music, or keyboard music. So this is why we still practice this art. It's thinking of voices as moving melodically, horizontally, while hearing harmonies, individual chords vertically at the same time. And this practice is at the heart of learning how to write and compose good harmonic progressions, much like an artist learns to draw in a realistic style, even if they're interested in abstract painting. Remember that contrary and oblique motion of voices helps voices sound independent. This is something that you want to strive for, right? The other types of motion, parallel and similar, are okay, but remember, contrary and oblique are better if you can find ways to make those happen in your progression. A couple of other things about SATB style. So parallel motion between perfect octaves or fifths is not found in most common practice compositions. You'll always hear the dreaded parallel perfects. Do not put a parallel octave or a parallel fifth in your SATB voice lighting. Now, parallel fifths do appear as a kind of doubling of a melody, and certainly parallel octaves are very common in this as well. And you hear that in rock and folk music. Well, they don't sound bad at all. In fact, they sound quite pleasing as sonorities. But remember, it's different. They sound more like a harmonization rather than a chordal progression. And I'll talk more about this as the course goes on. But remember, we're avoiding writing these because we're trying to make the melodic aspect of the chordal progression the most important. And that's what we call voice leading. So before we look at some voice leading guidelines, it's important to look at the most important thing that I brought up at the beginning, this 5-1 chord connection, or the 5 to a minor 1. Remember, following the most important guidelines to write music in the common practice style, SATB and keyboard voicings. This will help you really get a good idea of how chords are connected one by one in the most clear way. So when connecting 5 and 1, always resolve the leading tone up to the tonic. We will run into some exceptions to this, but for the most part, you can always know that when a tendency has, or when a note has a tendency to go to a certain note, it's best to follow that tendency. In this case, the leading tone goes up to the tonic. Keep the common tone 5 in the same voice. You'll notice that the dominant and tonic chords have a voice in common, right? It's the fifth. So, for example, in C major, the 5 chord, the root is G, and going to the 1 chord, G belongs to that 1 chord. It's in C, but it's the fifth. Those two voices should stay the same. This creates smooth voice leading. Always approach perfect intervals by contrary or oblique motion. Now, this is perfect intervals, right? Perfect fifth, perfect octaves especially. Now, similar motion is acceptable in any inner voice, or if the soprano moves by step, but usually in the outer voices, soprano and bass, is to be avoided. Follow the other principles of good spacing, doubling, and voice leading that we talked about during week 1. We don't want to have too much space or space larger than an octave between the soprano and the alto, or the alto and the tenor. This becomes too sparse, and it takes away from the desired quality of the chord. So the best practice is always avoid large skips or jumps if you can. Always avoid it. So when you look at your voice leading, you're seeing all of these skips and jumps going. That's something to avoid. You know that you've done something that is not appropriate for the common practice style. Now, one exception to this is, of course, the bass. The bass voice is allowed to jump around the most. It has the most independence. Stepwise motion should always be used whenever possible. And I'll stress that again. Go for stepwise motion if you can, or holding pitches to their same note whenever possible. And it's not always possible. So a couple of things here. We can see in the voice leading of 4 progressions. They're all 5-1, slightly different. Now 2 are in D major, and I have 2 in D minor over here. You'll notice that in D major, the leading tone is C sharp. Here in the soprano voice, it resolves up. In the case that the leading tone goes to the tonic in the bass voice, it will create an inverted dominant chord, the 5-6. But it's still the same thing. It must resolve up to tonic. Leading tone to tonic, leading tone to tonic. Here we see good space between all the voices. Do you see any parallel fifths or parallel octaves? No. So that these progressions will work. Now, in D minor, remember that the leading tone is essentially borrowed from major, right? It's an accidental. C sharp isn't a part of the D minor natural scale, the natural minor scale. So that's why we practice it in the harmonic minor scale and the melodic minor scale. So here we've raised the leading tone, C sharp to D and C sharp to D, in a way that's identical in major. So the only difference between all of these progressions here, in this fact, our tonic chord is minor. Now let's look at the voice leading considerations that we should probably avoid. But by first, we are dealing with parallel intervals. We can see that certain parallel intervals are okay. They're not parallel perfect intervals, because thirds are either major or minor, or in some case diminished or augmented. But in most common practice music, you're going to find them to be minor thirds or major thirds. So this is okay. This kind of parallel movement here that we see between the soprano and alto voice, here in D minor, C sharp, the leading tone, goes up to D like it should, and we've put the E of this 5 chord, right, which is the A major dominant chord, goes up to the 3rd scale degree. That's fine. Now, parallel octaves should be avoided. Here, what will happen is the bass voice, A to D, is identical to the movement of the soprano voice. So really, the soprano voice loses its independence, or maybe vice versa. But really, you would hear this just to be a doubling or a mimicking of the bass voice. Now, the tenor and the alto voices have their independence. We can hear them. They're not creating that aural effect. So we avoid this. Even though spacing and everything else looks fine, you create the parallel octaves. We should never do that in SATB voice leading. Like the parallel octaves, the parallel fifths are a little bit easier to spot, and I have a typo right here. Goodness, that should be a D. So that, excuse me, this should be an A in the bass. A in the bass. That should be a perfect fifth, A to E, showing you parallel fifths. I apologize. This should also be avoided. But I trust all of you can see through this error. Now, some other voice leading considerations too. Now, certainly, what if you repeat parallel fifths? You're not moving what you're repeating. That's okay. That happens. In this case, you'll notice that this is a 1 chord and another 1 chord, but the voicing changes. Even though this is the same chord, and we would experience this as the same harmony, by changing the voicing, you still have a sense of movement. So here's a 1 going to a 5. So remember, repeating parallel octaves or parallel fifths is okay. Now, contrary octaves are to be avoided. They give the same effect as parallel octaves. So here the A and the A goes to an octave, right, of D and D. Octave, octave. They're not parallel, but they're contrary. Here, contrary fifths should also be avoided. So you have a fifth here going to another fifth. The reason why is because those will very much sound like voice swapping, or in a way very similar to how we experience parallel octaves and parallel fifths. And you can see her examples of this in chapter 12, where she demonstrates these voice leading guidelines on page 250.